Hello, everybody. Welcome to another ASFP Sparking Interest Podcast. We've been busy here getting notable guests in to talk to, and some of those have already gone out, some are due to go out. And I hope you're sort of getting some value from that. I was going to say enjoyment, but I'm not quite sure if that's allowed in some of the serious topics we're talking about. But I hope you're finding them useful. Anyway, so that trend continues, and for no less a reason than today we have Mark Wilson from HSE, who kindly came and presented at the ASFP's technical event at Bristol earlier this year. That's part of ASFP's regional series of events. We like to get outside of London because we listened to our members and they said stop doing everything in London. 2 or 3 years ago, that's what we decided to do. So, Mark Wilson, welcome to the ASFP.
Thank you.
Welcome to this corner of the West Midlands. HSE, you've been... Your role as an organisation has evolved since 2017. You've been nominated to be one of the overarching authorities in terms of policing what we do as an industry, all the way through, the process.
Regulating.
Yeah, I think police is probably too. You've probably got more powers than the police. So certainly in our world. What impact has that had on HSE? Before we get into the sort of, it'd be good to give our members an overview, probably, because one of the beauties of this podcast is our members don't have to sit down at 7:00 on a Saturday. We're not competing with Britain's Got Talent. Where people view this stuff is that they can watch it on their phone in the cab of their van just before they go and install a load of passive fire protection. So it's accessible. And they may not have a full understanding of your HSE's role in their world. So it's probably good to get a little potted history of where you've come to and what that effectively means.
Yeah, well, I joined HSE in, I think it was November 2021. So I wasn't part of HSE before that. So, but I do know that it's been a huge change in the organisation. It's effectively, I think, with the introduction of the BSR, it might be wrong about the exact numbers on this, but I think it's more or less doubled in size as a result of it. The BSR taking on those functions. So there's been a lot of churn internally in HSE, people moving between their sort of traditional bread and butter role, which was regulating health and safety at work, but moving over into the BSR side and setting it up as a new sort of organisation. And so, I mean, it's been a very sort of energising sort of process, I think, because I suppose you could accuse HSE of being a sort of fairly traditional civil service department, and this has really introduced a whole new area of work and new opportunities for the staff that were there, and bringing in a lot of new staff as well, which is like me, which really sort of energised the organisation, I guess.
And I'm assuming they've had to go on a recruitment drive to bring people in who were in other sectors of the design, construction industry, and you're part of that because your history is planning.
Yeah. I came from I've worked in local government, consultancy, and central government, and so. Latterly, I was working for, but before I came to HSE, I was working for the Planning Inspectorate, but it was in their sort of national infrastructure area. So we were running the sort of consenting regime for major bits of new infrastructure, like new motorways and nuclear power station down in Somerset and over in Sizewell and Suffolk. So I was sort of steeped in that for about, nearly 10 years. And then I saw everyone was impacted by the Grenfell tragedy, and I saw they were creating this new BSR organisation to as a response to that, and I just thought it would be something very different and something very compelling in terms of the sort of the ethics of it all as well.
Yeah.
Trying to make a difference. I know it sounds a bit trite, but you know, if you're involved in public service, that's part of the reason why you're there. You're certainly not there for the money. So
No, I know. Yes, trade associations. I mean, we're only sort of, trade associations are strange because they're representative of a sector of an industry, but you're sort of only one step away from, you know, a more the sort of type of, you know, environment that you're probably more used to. We sort of sit between the two. You know, some of our rules and regulations are very, you would recognise, you know, in terms of our bylaws and things like that. So you've been obviously involved for a couple of years now, and I think your level where you were focusing on is Gateway 1 in terms of, and I want to get the phrase right because there's nothing worse than, and I constantly keep being corrected on my phraseology, normally to do with competency. So just for anyone watching this, just define what Gateway 1 is and what it means at the start of the whole, you know, design and construction process.
So as part of the Dame Judith Hackett report, one of her recommendations, or one of the first recommendations she made, was that there should be some oversight of fire safety design at the planning stage. And this was responding to things that happened at Grenfell, like the fact that the fire service access had been degraded over the years because of development that had gone on around the Grenfell Tower. And also, there was the whole list of things that potentially could have been dealt with at the planning stage, or whether it was development around the Grenfell Tower or the development of the actual tower itself. What the government's response to the Dame Judith Hackett report was to set up a statutory consultee at the planning stage to look at fire safety in tall residential buildings, defined slightly differently in the planning stage as relevant buildings rather than higher risk buildings. Higher risk buildings also at the building control stage include hospitals and care homes, but at the planning stage we're looking at educational accommodation and residential accommodation. We were set up and we started a lot earlier than the rest of the BSR regime because we weren't waiting for the Building Safety Act to get royal assent, because we were created through tweaks and amendments to existing planning legislation, which effectively set us up as a statutory consultee in the planning regime, and also created some information that should be provided at the planning stage in the form of a fire statement form. So those two elements basically set us up, and then since August 2021 we've been the statutory consultee for any, and this is different as well to the building control regime. So we look at development, not buildings, and sometimes a development is just a building, but we look at the development, and it's not just the development itself, it's any development within the curtilage of a relevant building as well. So anything that could affect access to the building, we would comment on as well. So it's a new. We're some new kid on the block, and in both the planning regime, but also it's the first time that fire safety has really been taken seriously in a formal sense at the planning stage. It was always something that was sort of delegated off to the building control stage, and that's certainly something I experienced as a planner in my sort of years working for local authority.
And the problem with that is, of course, is you're relying on a building control, a local authority building control officer or approved inspector to have that level of sort of intimate skills and knowledge to be able to deliver something, and that's not always the case, and that's not against that as that group, but they've been asked to cover so many different aspects of the project, even during the construction of it or the change of use, and I spent quite a bit of time in Kensington and Chelsea 15 years ago, as those houses where let's say made to be open plan, and you had some of these ridiculous ideas of creating 5-story deep basements with a swimming pool and a cinema on 3 or 4 stories down, and of course because they're domestic residences, you don't need to submit the plans to the fire authorities. So if there's a fire in about 5-story, the bottom of a 5-story basement, they've got no idea how to look at that. So it was an interesting thing that was going on, and your average building control officer's got to contend with stuff like that. Because there was actually the thing I learnt about that was there was less red tape to go underground than there was to go higher up or further out the back, because that attracted more issues effectively. So it was an interesting, they clearly, it wasn't a loophole, but they were clearly taking the the easier route, and there was quite a lot of companies popped up at the time. There was one, I don't think they're around anymore. They were called the London Basement Company.
All right.
And you could, literally around Kensington and Chelsea, that you could probably walk in an hour of walking around, you would have seen 10 hoardings, all with London Basement, all with, little mini diggers digging big holes in the ground with neighbours either side with, party walls and stuff. You just thought this I thought at the time, this can't be sustainable.
Yeah, I think the sort of basement development in London has become more controversial. I don't know if it's not an area of work I've been involved in, but I don't know whether the government's or local authorities have not legislated, but have developed policies in relation to that.
I think it's when they started digging underneath their neighbours, rather than just sticking to the, they started creating bunkers and stuff. So it has been a challenge for them, and I suppose. And I know, there's legislation change for approved inspectors and building control officers. We know there's a thing at the moment that, they have to prove their competency, and that's creating a bit of a bottleneck. And I think there's been an extension applied, hasn't there, in terms of the cut-off period for that. And like all of these things, I think whatever the gestation period or the evolvement period is, it's always it's a bit like, it's like you watch Grand Designs and they go, we're going to spend £200,000 on this self-build and it's going to take a year. And when Kev goes around and talks to them, it's cost £500,000 and it's taken 3 years. And that's always the case with, these things. And it's a similar thing, I think, and we won't talk about this because this is a different conversation. I know I'm not going to ask you because you won't answer. But this proposal or the consultation that's currently going on over the removal of 476 from ADB, we, as an association, we don't have a view either way. Our job will be to support the transition of whatever change is arrived at. Because if it said that, everyone's got a year, then we probably would argue against that. If it's 5 years and, then there's a reasonable stab at getting everybody over the line, and move them on to whatever becomes, what's required. So, we're very aware of those types of changes and the time they take. So in terms of where you are now, Gateway 1 has been running for, I think it was being Gateway 1, it was the first part, and I know recently Gateway 2 and 3 came into play, and we had a man here the other day, and I made a statement to him that said our understanding is that there weren't any new build applications that had gone through into Gateway 2, and he said I was wrong, and he said you're wrong, Mike. I think he said there were 2 or 3 that had gone through, so clearly I was wrong. Which I'm fine being wrong, by the way. I like being wrong on these things because it gives whoever, like somebody like you, the opportunity to actually explain what the reality or the truth of it is, rather than my misguided interpretation or of it. So in terms of Gateway 1, what does that mean to certainly our part of so we have principal contractors in members. We've got 7 or 8 of the main contractors. We've got in membership, we've got architects in membership. We have specialist subcontractors. We have most of the passive fire manufacturers. We have some building control, some approved inspectors, and some facilities management organisations. So pretty much across the spectrum of design and construction and occupation. What does Gateway 1 mean to that section of design and construction?
Well, I mean, passive fire protection is probably more relevant in Gateway 1 than anything else, because we're looking at the shape and the shape of the building or the development, the space, and all of that is fundamental to passive fire protection. So our objective at Planning Gateway 1 is to avoid poor fire safety design getting baked in at the planning stage and then going forward. And I sometimes describe it as the sort of traditional role of the sort of fire specialist, the fire community's role going forward has quite often been characterised as troubleshooting. You get a sort of ready-made design from the planning stage, and at that point you've got a planning permission, so you can't mess around with the dimensions of the building or anything anymore. So you're basically left trying to make the best of a bad job, or putting makeup on a pig, as I've sometimes called it.
Yes, that was a phrase you used in Bristol. I must admit I didn't write that one down, but I will now. I'm going to steal it. I'll put it into something.
And I've often, my sort of, I would admittedly fairly limited experience of interaction with the fire community is, I wouldn't describe it as feeling sorry for them, but I've often thought if your role was more than just this sort of troubleshooting role, if it was more than just being handed a design, if you were actually involved in the fundamentals of that design from the start, which I think is what Gateway 1 is increasingly demanding of the fire profession, it'd be far more fulfilling, I think. So I've always, there's a certain element to this of there's a lot of change as a result of Planning Gateway 1 and the wider BSR regime, and part of my role, I suppose, is to settle nerves around that change, but give people a sense of direction. And as part of that, I think saying, and the implications are that fire safety design is now far more critical as a fundamental design element than it has been today. I'm not saying that people completely ignored it at the sort of early design stage in the past, but I think it certainly didn't have the sort of emphasis that it has now in terms of the need to make sure that, especially in this current era where we've got, increasing pressure to build up because of scarcity of land and all the politics around greenbelt land and greenfield sites and brownfield sites. I mean, the number of developments that are over 7 stories or 18 meters is increasing significantly. I think it was something like in terms of the casework that we are predicted to get over the years, the sort of benchmark is that we'll increase the anticipated casework volumes by about 3% a year, I think, based on how many more relevant buildings are coming into being over the year. So. Yeah.
No, I think it is. I think it's a difficult task because our industry was always seen as you're right. It's hard to say. It's not that it wasn't considered. I think there's been 2 issues. One is where does the responsibility of designing it in lie? And if you talk to a principal contractor, they'll say it's with the architect. If you talk to the architect, they'll say, well, it's with the principal contractor because, there's a sort of blank space on that page of the design. And a lot of that's been driven by the lack of competence within designing in passive. And that comes from the traditional way that architects learn. So they get a degree, part 1, they go to a practice and do their dissertation, and they do their part 2, and then they do their final project and get a part 3 and become get their PhD, a Doctor of Architecture. But there's so little attention spent on passive fire, and I know that people who watch these podcasts, I've mentioned it before, but my son is just about to graduate from Nottingham in architecture, and I've kept him very focused on how much time do they spend on the science and profession of passive fire protection, and within 3 years I think they brushed across it in about half a day. Well, you can't expect him to go to a practice in the next few months and be given his Apple Macintosh and his stainless steel retractable German pencil and say, you're doing all the passive fire on this project, Sam. Because he'll go, well, thanks for that, but I didn't do that. Because they'll sub it out to a fire engineer. So I think there's a duty on the architectural profession, supported by the likes of the RIBA, to say that they need to learn differently, and they can't rely on just CPDs. I know they have the CPD program, but that isn't going to. There's some very specialist areas that they don't touch on, and they've relied on specialists. But the problem is those specialists, especially now, are fewer and further between. HSE's probably employed some of them, and others are freelance and driving around in their Lamborghinis because that's the value of them at the moment. So they can't rely just on the traditional way of doing it, and they can't pass down responsibility as much as the principal contractors can't pass up responsibility to the designers. And they're going through a period of step change now about how they develop themselves.
I think architects do have a role, but then architects are usually the principal designers, which is obviously a defined role now. And
yes,
and so they will inevitably be usually leading on the design work, but that doesn't mean to say that the specialist fire input has to be secondary in some way. I mean, the whole point of for example, we quite often advocate the starting the QDR process, the quality design review process, earlier to inform the early initial design stages, and I think that will be quite key to getting proper, well-designed passive fire protection built into these developments at the earliest opportunity. And that QDR process requires collaborative working between not just regulators, but between architects and fire specialists.
Yep.
And so we've recently, last year about this time, we published guidance, and we do bang on about QDRs quite a bit as a sort of best practice way to make sure that the fire safety design is considered right from the earliest sort of ideas about the design. I've been in meetings usually about issues related to things that we've objected to in our comments on a planning application, and there's obviously sometimes quite a lot at stake, and we get quite a sort of a stellar cast list from the design team. So you'll sometimes usually have the architect there, the client will be there, and then the fire engineer is there as well. And occasionally it's obvious that the fire engineer's under a lot of pressure. You've got some sort of angry gammon of a client sort of boring their eyes into them, and they're trying to have a conversation with us about stuff which, we're not saying we're right about everything 100% of the time, and sometimes we do change our minds based on these conversations, but quite often we're talking about fairly fundamental first principle fire safety issues because the design's at such an early stage. And you can just sometimes see that the fire engineer is not able to say what they really want to say. And
it's a terrible design, and we can't engineer the fire safety into it.
There's only so much makeup we can apply to this pig, basically. But we, I've been in that situation as well when I worked in consultancy. I know what it's like to have a client breathing down your throat. But I think there's no escape from the fact that fire engineers are going to sort of get their sharp elbows out and make their way to the top table when it comes to the designing of these developments. They're going to have to be prepared to have difficult conversations with their clients, things that they don't want to hear. I'm not saying they have to do that in front of us at a meeting like that, but behind the scenes they need to force the issue.
No, and I think that is, and I think moving down through the sort of, or moving across the design and construction. Let's call it. I mean, the RIBA plan of work is a good, is a good model to sort of meander through. A lot of our members are now focusing on early engagement, and I think, and this is where the principal contractors, because you're right. There's principal design. You have principal designer, as in there's now 8,000 series standards out there for the competency of a principal designer and the competency of a principal contractor. So they can't ignore the fact that document makes demands and requirements on them, to take themselves to a place that, they haven't historically been before. I think one of the missing parts, though, is actually how they achieve the requirements of those standards, because although the standards define, what they should be doing as a profession, the mechanisms aren't always there. It's, it takes you back to the President Kennedy, by the end of the century, we want to put man on the moon and bring them safely back again. Well, that's your rocket science. But of course, there's all those poor beggars that then have the rocket engineering to work out how they're going to get 3 people there and bring them back. Mm-hmm. And that's a completely different conversation. So I think, as much as those are there, and it's good that they're there, it's great that they're there, it emphasises their responsibility, certainly at the very further up the what I call the body politic of the design and construction chain, which is, let's face it, culture is top down in any society. So they are effectively the top of the body politic. Maybe only the client sits above them, but or organisations like you sort of sitting next to them, but they set the tone of the culture. So they should be doing that. But I'm still slightly concerned that there's mechanisms for them to achieve it.
I've always found in my dealings with the sort of architecture community and casework that the architects have always been fairly not been bullish.
No.
They've always been fairly open to questioning their designs and adapting them, and quite open. It's usually the client who's the problem child in that sort of scenario.
Yes, because perception is reality, isn't it? They have a perception of what they want, and the reality turns into something different. I think the phrase design and build now has 2 meanings. For those of us old enough to remember what design and build originally meant, it was a method of construction that was designed for building a distribution centre that got migrated into used to build complex buildings. That method should never, have been used, and it created all sorts of problems because the design responsibility sat with the principal contractor, who then, was
driven by spreadsheets
and taking out costs to maximise value. And you as a client, that building's going to cost £100 million to build, and you get there to finally look at it, and you've got a £10 million building because the contractor made £90 million of savings, and it sort of looks the same, but it's not.
Value engineering will always be a feature of the building industry. It's inevitable. It's good practice probably in some respects to make sure.
Well, it is, but
delivering value for money.
And this is where I do get on my soapbox. Yeah. Value engineering is good if it's not to the detriment of the safety and the performance of the building.
That's what I was going to say. I suppose the zeitgeist and the dial has moved, and what represented value for money back in the day is not the same thing anymore post Grenfell. And you can see that in the number of planning applications that we're getting that are actually asking to amend an existing permission to put in an additional staircase and things like that. So maybe decisions that were taken well, certainly before 2021 when we came into existence, are being revisited, and a lot of the pressure for that is coming from investors. That's what the feedback is to us, is that the banks, whoever it is, the investors in these buildings and developments are wanting to future-proof their investment, and so they are asking for. Well, I suppose we've had the new ADB come in with the 2 stairs sort of guidance now, but we were getting those sort of applications to make those changes to put in a second stair from the start of 2022. So
they were almost anticipating the fact that what was coming down the track. What's your and people that sit on the sofa with me say you're the king of 90 degrees in terms of a conversation. So let's take it. Let's just go sharp right, and let's just talk about the 2 staircase, because it created quite a lot of debate, and it created some pretty big polarisation of views on its value or necessity. We don't have a view. I got asked a lot about the 2 staircase debate, and I said, I don't have a view. What I can tell you is ASFP members will make sure if it's 1 staircase or 2 or 3 or 4, there'll be all protected routes in terms of compartmentation and protecting the tenable zone and means of escape. Whether there's 1 staircase or 4, we don't care, because that's not a debate that's not an area that the ASFP covers. Organisations like the FPA or the National Fire Chiefs Council or people like that might have a view, but we didn't necessarily have a view. Ben Bradford from BB7 had a view. I think he told us what the view was. I'm sure he did. And I think a man from, and I'm going to try and get this right, is it Opus Digital? Opus Digital.
Yeah, it does ring a bell.
Yeah. So a man had a view. General consensus was it was split down the middle. I think half the people we talked to said it was a sort of emotional knee-jerk reaction, and the other half said it was a good idea and required. So without putting you on the spot, Mark, or causing you embarrassment, what was your view, or did HSE have a view, or did you have a view?
Well, I mean, at the moment we're still applying the extant guidance, and whether it's 991 or ADB or both, and our view from the very start, applying the existing guidance, was if you're going to have a single stair, then our tolerance for what that single stair connects with is going to be much less than what has been the default sort of expectation in the past. So a lot of the early days of PGO's work was dealing with single stair designs that were connecting to cover car parks and basements and all sorts of ancillary accommodation, and we took a sort of fairly firm line that we weren't prepared to accept those designs anymore, which made our conversations very fraught, especially in the early days with developers who were proposing those designs. When we get a 2-stair design and you're allowed to lobby things off and attach different ancillary uses to those each of those stairs, then it made our job an awful lot easier, because we were able, we weren't so much interested in the lobbying side of things, because that was internal alterations. It wasn't really a planning issue, but in terms of the fundamentals of the building and the shape of it, having that space for 2 firefighting shafts, or a firefighting shaft and a protected escape stair or something like that, made all the difference to us in terms of the ease of our casework. I don't have any firm views about the debate where I know there's been a body of opinion that said you can have a single stair and you can make it safe, and it can be as safe as having 2 stairs. But my experience in the casework that we saw was that where there was a single stair, it quite often, more often than not, was not being proposed in a sort of safe way. And I think the idea that single stairs in the future are going to be completely banned, that's not what this guidance achieves. There'll always be, I think for new builds, if you're going to have a single stair design, then the rationale for it and the reasons for it have got to be really compelling. And I would, certainly looking at it from as a planner, I would say that things like, you know, if there's a sort of heritage element, a listed building element to the design, which would mean 2 stairs would be too heavy-handed treatment of the building, or if there's other site constraints like the topography of the site or something like that. I think if you've got a fairly standard site and you're putting some new build on it, the rationale for having a single stair design, if you're building above the height threshold of 18 metres and 7 stories, is not there. Especially, well, it's certainly not there in the sense that the guidance has changed.
Yeah, and it depends. I mean, you know, we don't. The issues at Grenfell were multifaceted. You know, the cladding was clearly the major contributing factor, and the fire, you know, which effectively then developed on the outside of the building, was effectively the same cause and effect as a boundary issue. You know, it's the reason why if there was another tower block within a within a certain distance of that tower block, so if they'd built 2 in the 1960s and they were quite close together, you know, both the facing elevations of those 2 buildings would have had to have a level of, you know, fire protection to stop fire spread from one to the other. But of course, no one knew how the cladding was going to perform in a fire situation. But effectively, they ended up with the same scenario that you would protect against in a building that was very close to it. And, you know, like you say, I mean, there's the whole greenfield, brownfield debate. Did you know there's a brownfield centre in Wolverhampton?
Yes, I've been past it on the train.
Have you?
Yeah.
You should go in. They've got laboratories in the basement. Do you know what they test? Soil.
Oh, yeah.
So Max and I went. We had a whole day there, didn't we, Max? And they showed us their soil laboratories, and it was, and they've got this loads of really expensive equipment, and it's designed. I mean, if you imagine you've got brownfield sites, I mean, the Black Country is a really good example. So, you know, the start of the Industrial Revolution, you know, you've got all these nasties that are probably still in the ground around there.
Like
you've got
cyanide and all sorts of
cyanide, lead, all sorts of stuff. And of course, you know, they're knocking stuff down that has maybe been recycled once or twice over the last 200 years. But of course, if you knocked a building down 100 years ago and built something on it, no one had any concept of the damage that, you know, maybe an industrial site that had been originally built on what would have been greenfield originally, and then they're now building on it, you know, 100 years later. The Victorians would have had no idea what the Georgians and their predecessors had been doing. And there is, that debate that about it's easier to build on greenfield because, you know, the build costs are less because you don't have all of those issues. I mean, that actually, ironically, of course, and it's a bad example because you can't compare it to anywhere else in the country and very few places else in the world. Most of construction in London is brownfield construction. It's not greenfield construction because there is no green. There is no green field. I mean, try building on Hyde Park. I'm sure somebody would have something to say. So they have been dealing with brownfield construction for years because historically that's what happens in London. Outside of London, of course, it's, you know, spread the love, you know, spread it around. It's easier to build on that field than it is to build on something else. And, you know, is there a view that I mean, I know the government, I think, generally favoured brownfield. It was a question of recycling what you'd already got rather than constantly keeping building. And I think, you know, if you look at the storms they had in Dubai, that's representative of issues of constantly building over. So the first time I went to Dubai was probably 15, 20 years ago. It wasn't as well developed. I spent a lot of time there because my previous life was putting, fire systems into a lot of the stuff that was built. You know, Sheikh Zayed Road, I've walked up and down. I lost count of the times I've walked up and down there.
They've had a few cladding fires in Dubai as well.
Yeah.
I've seen them.
So, but of course, the thing that people maybe don't realise is that the roads in Dubai don't have drainage systems because they expect the water to either just run off and soak into the sand or just dry out as the sun comes back out. And it has happened before. I've been there when they've had heavy rain and you're driving through water and everything, comes to a stop for a while, or, there's a few bumps and bangs and crashes. But they've, a bit like Britain with snow, they don't account for rain in their infrastructure. And the problem's now been exacerbated by the fact they've built on more and more and more of the land, and therefore the water's got less and less places to soak away when it does rain. And what you're seeing is the result of mass sprawl of construction in Dubai, building over what originally the water would have soaked away into. And I think that's an example of what we're seeing now. I mean, it must be easier to build on brownfield if it's, I suppose, beneficial to do so.
There's a whole industry related to, and government policy is definitely brownfield first, before considering things like, making alterations to a greenbelt boundary and things.
Well, this is a good example here, because this estate we're on, we were talking earlier that it was a 1980s, light commercial industrial. No, it wasn't industrial. It was definitely white collar, not blue collar. There's no factories or units here. So, and now what's happening is because those units are less occupied, they're knocking them down and building student accommodation because the uni's just next door.
Yeah,
that's a good reuse of space. It's a change of use, I know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll leave that for the local planning authority.
Of course,
to decide.
I don't know what Coventry City Council's view is on that.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of the sort of brownfield developments and the city centre developments. I mean, let's face it, the tall residential is more often than not than in existing urban areas. And most of the planning applications we get are demolish X, Y, and Z, and then build this. So, I mean, that comes with its own set of sort of challenges. Sometimes the sites are sort of odd-shaped, depending on how the land assembly's been done. Sometimes we've had to look at things like third-party access for getting a fire service, fire appliance into, relying on third parties' access rights to get a fire appliance onto or into a site. These are all things we've had to tackle and are, I wouldn't say standard, but they're common occurrences in the context of developing in complex urban environments. But there's, certainly we see a lot of, there's obviously a boom in student accommodation at the moment, and we see a lot of developments coming forward in what were previously industrial areas. I know in Bristol, from my experience, the sort of area around the back of the train station there, it's called St Philip's Marsh, and that's all being turned over to a huge sort of University of Bristol development and the associated residential development going on around it. And we've been commenting on all those applications as well. And certainly when we were looking at things like change of use of existing buildings, which you can do now much more straightforwardly through the planning system, because of permitted development rights to allow you to change a use from, for example, an office to student accommodation or residential.
Or a hotel.
Yeah.
Hotels, I mean, some of the Premier Inns, there are other budget hotels are available. You find yourself, you suddenly realise you're staying in a 1960s office building.
Yeah. I mean, we don't, if it's purely a hotel, we wouldn't get consulted on that. But certainly the refurbishment of existing buildings is probably some of our most complex casework that we deal with, because you're having to accept that there's an existing situation in some circumstances that you have to be pragmatic about. But then again, you've got to balance that with, if you're changing, we've had developments in for sort of 20 plus story towers, office towers that are turning over to residential. And sometimes we're commenting, we've got some objections to this from a fire safety perspective, and the answer comes back, well, this is an existing situation. But where do you set the bar in terms of what is your level of expectation in terms of the investment and level of change that you would expect in that building that's having a fairly fundamental development done to it in terms of change of use? And that's a big development, turning a 20-story tower into a from an office into resi, you'd expect a commensurate level of investment in the fire safety provisions in that building. And when we don't see it, and there's, I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule around this, but when we don't see it and we're not convinced, then we are raising objections about those sort of developments. So yeah, we're dealing with a complex urban environment, existing building stock and new builds, and we're having to develop approaches based on the guidance and standards that we've got to all of that.